In the early 1900s, Russia was one of the most impoverished countries in Europe. At the time, the Russian Empire practiced serfdom and was composed of a big peasantry and a growing population of industrial workers. In 1861, the Russian Empire abolished serfdom, and freedom was granted towards the serfs, giving them the opportunity to organize. Around the turn of the 20th century, Russia began its industrialization, and along with it came big social and political changes. In 1917, Russia went through the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1922, with Vladimir Lenin's Red Army winning and establishing the Soviet Union. With the Bolsheviks in power, intense focus was put on industrialization and urbanization, which in turn put a lot of stress on the housing stock. At the time of the revolution in 1917, 80% of Russia's population lived in rural areas. In the 1990s, the opposite can be said, with 80% of the population living in urban areas. Factors such as poverty, privation, and the Soviet industrialization campaigns encouraged or forced people to move into the cities. Millions of people were migrating to the cities, but there were not enough houses available for them. Initially, Lenin's plan for housing was to confiscate homes from the bourgeoisie and place the people in them until better homes were built. The lack of homes in the new communist regime encouraged people to live together, creating the first communal apartments. These apartments were named kommunalkas and had a shared kitchen, bathing space, hallway, and one room assigned per family. These dwellings ranged from apartment buildings in big cities to low-rise buildings in smaller areas. In 1922, Joseph Stalin rose as the Soviet leader. The Soviet Union was underdeveloped due to factors that included World War I, the Civil War, and famine in 1917. Stalin placed his focus on rapid industrialization, building factories, transportation networks, and encouraging workers to work even harder. Stalin intended to turn the economy around and make the USSR competitive with capitalist countries. Stalin ruled with an iron fist and led nations through World War II. The population grew, causing an increase in the need for dwelling spaces. However, most of the resources were put into industry. Therefore, there wasn't enough urban housing for the population. The government wanted to bring housing for workers, which came in the form of communal apartments once more. Stalin created a new type of housing called stalinkas. Stalinkas were built from the late 1930s to the mid-1950s and were mostly in the neoclassical style. Stalinkas are known as two types, elite and ordinary. The well-built stalinkas were for the nomenklatura, or the elite of society. These buildings had a lot of space, high ceilings, and a lot of ornamentation. Ordinary stalinkas were for the common workers and often were assigned as communal housing. The lowest category were the low-rise buildings. The low-rise stalinkas did not need a lot of machinery to be constructed and were made out of materials like wood ceilings, cinder, or brick blocks. Some of these stalinkas lacked water, sewage, and heating. Stalin died in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev named himself as a potential successor. During the change in possession of power from Joseph Stalin to Nikita Khrushchev, people in the Soviet Union experienced drastic political, economic, and social changes. These changes greatly affected architecture. After World War II, much of the housing was destroyed. Khrushchev had to provide many housings in a short amount of time and as cheaply as possible. Therefore, he stated that excessive decoration were not only unnecessary but harmful, and as a result, the standardized panel buildings produced at his initiative were defined by straight, plain lines and were devoid of literally any architectural details that were not considered functional. This minimalist mindset became the reality and was named Khrushchevka. These buildings were no taller than 5 and no lower than 3 stories, allowing them to be built without an elevator. They were built out of prefabricated ready concrete panels and just had to be assembled together. This made construction extremely fast and easy. The quickest construction time for a Khrushchevka was 5 days. Families were given private apartments based on the size of their family. The interior was laid out not to waste any space and be completely functional. This mentality can be seen in the fact that a casket cannot be carried through its stairway without entering other apartments to turn. The buildings were supposed to be temporary dwellings until better housing is built, but many people in Russia still live in them today. Khrushchevkas made their way throughout all of the Soviet Union, and their silhouettes are recognizable and can be found even in Berlin. The next successor of the Soviet Union was Leonid Brezhnev. The government's priorities were directed largely to foreign and military affairs. However, Brezhnev did leave a mark on Soviet housing. He was in charge while architects designed an evolution of the Khrushchevka, a new building coined with the term Brezhnevka. Unlike the Khrushchevka, the Brezhnevka ranged from 9 to 17 floors high, which required elevators and trash chutes to be built. In the plans of the actual apartments, there is a trend in moving the private rooms away from noisy communal areas of the building, further emphasizing Soviets' transition from communal to private dwellings. There were many details that separated the new structures from its predecessor, but the material of panel and brick, as well as the form, remained practically unchanged. The building would rarely stand alone and are arranged next to each other to form long building complexes. Furthermore, the Brezhnevka had taller ceilings, bigger rooms, built-in storage spaces, and larger stairways. During Brezhnev's tenure, around 40 different variations of the Brezhnevka were developed, all of which were united by these same principles, as well as the style of construction and materials. After Brezhnev's death, the Soviet Union saw a quick succession of leaders as Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko both passed away a year into their terms. During this time, a young Mikhail Gorbachev was gaining popularity in the Soviet government. Gorbachev ended up being elected as head of the Soviet Union in 1985. Upon election, Gorbachev sought to revive Russia's economy, which was crushed during Brezhnev's tenure. Gorbachev wanted Russia to enter the free market after being under the Iron Veil for a long period of time. Furthermore, he sought to ease tensions that had been brewing during the Cold War. In August 1991, a coup was launched by radical communists, formed by government, military, and police personnel, coming out against Gorbachev's actions. With the Soviet Union's power weakening, Gorbachev resigned from his post a few months later, which marked the end of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin was a member of the Communist Party and stepped in for Gorbachev during the 1991 coup. However, after the Soviet Union fell apart, he became the first president of Russia, declaring himself in favor of a market-oriented economy and supporting the autonomy of the former USSR states. This led to a massive boom of privatization, where the government companies and property were being sold for cheap. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that the government was no longer in charge of housing, and all the work fell on the private sector. This led to a big culture shock among residents, providing them with an opportunity to purchase housing, while also giving birth to new corruption and less quality control. Novostroika is a term for these new age buildings. Some apartment complexes have been developed thoughtfully, such as Novogorsk and Khimki. These apartments, nestled in the woods near a nature reserve, feature thoughtful use of landscape design, including playgrounds, gathering areas, as well as underground parking. The design doesn't overwhelm the landscape with its size, and has a modern facade with spaces protruding from it. With that being said, many people still prefer a Soviet building to a Novostroika for complaints of quality and lack of infrastructure. This is due to the fact that, more often than not, these apartments are situated on the outskirts of a city. With similar apartment buildings surrounding them, seemingly endless apartment districts are formed, with no other structures to break it up. In some cases, such as the infamous Murino neighborhood on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, the urban planning leaves no clear parking plan, forcing cars to occupy pedestrian areas, as well as having little to no parks, community areas, and civic or business centers. These neighborhoods are left severely underdeveloped, with unfinished buildings and roads spread throughout. Private developers have to pay large prices for the land and desire to make as much money out of it as they can. This is a direct consequence of the quick shift in economic policy and the lack of government regulation on the housing market. Housing in Soviet countries has been shaped by the communist regime for almost a century, finally culminating in the fall of the Soviet Union, and bringing with it a new age of private housing and new issues.